Yo, so I've been seeing a lot of questions relating this Mundo pick that G2 actually deployed against Movistar Koi specifically in their recent game in the LEC. I think it's a pretty interesting pick. I think this is a good example of the adaptations that go deeper and deeper as we unearth the abilities of Fearless Draft. And like, no pick is safe is basically the mindset behind this, right? You can always bail yourself out of a bad draft with this new format with creative solutions. And I think this is a really good example of that, and I want to break that down. So I've been seeing some comments saying like, oh yeah, Mundo can break his CC. Zyra can't do anything. But like, it's like yes and no, right? It's yes, mechanically is a common like let's say focus in terms of champions and like how they get countered and stuff, and that makes sense for conventional matchups. But more importantly, from a specific draft perspective, there's more variance in understanding that champion identities are usually what's being played for, not necessarily just matchups. So it hedges against the entire champion's being, let's put it that way. So that's a very strong way to put it, but that's basically fundamentally what champion picks represent, right? They represent certain styles and parts of your hand, and that's basically the way to think about it. So when you B1 Zyra and your Zyra jungle, it has a specific identity, right? Zyra is specifically a champion that is focused on high tempo full clearing, and she promotes a very slow pace of the game, right? The reason why G2 would deploy a pick like the Mundo is because in order to win against something like the Zyra, she can potentially counter a lot of the remaining, let's say, jungle picks that don't have much relevance anymore, right? All the priority picks in this point, because this is game 3 of the draft, right? All the priority picks at this point are basically gone. So a lot of, like, let's say, normal frontline junglers would actually probably not do that great into Zyra because of her ability to just outpace them if they make a single mistake. Mundo is very unique because he actually has an extremely fast clear in the jungle, contrary to what people believe. And because of this, he can actually match what Zyra tends to do and actually then introduce that counter pick because he's such a strong frontliner as well. So it changes the name of Zyra's sort of like game plan from one that she can just comfortably full clear into one where she's actually pressured to put pressure on the map and actually have to do something about this Mundo, or else she's going to get outscaled. That's basically where the context of this draft basically comes in, right? And overall, the rest of this draft is really hard for Movistar as well because they're drafting to not lose at this point. A lot of the priority picks are gone. And it's always really scary when you're doing things like Brahman on B3 because it's a very comp-defining pick. Basically, at this point, Movistar's comp is fully revealed, even though they only have 3 champions picked. And maybe they're feeling pretty confident about that, and they can see that they countered G2's Caitlyn pick a little bit because this comp wouldn't fare too well. Caitlyn doesn't fare too well against this comp, so it makes sense, right? But it gives a lot of time for G2 to still respond here, especially when they do a Scion B4 as well, right? It makes a lot of sense, but contextually, that's why the pick is so strong here, because by itself, Movistar promote a style where nothing's going to happen in the early game, and that's exactly what G2 want, because their win condition is actually through this jungle pick. It sounds really weird. Why is a win condition through a tank, right? Well, it's because this scaling matchup with the Mundo is going to be so emphasized, and it completely cucks the identity of the Zyra, essentially, right? That's where this comes in. And they round it out with a really strong, high-value front-to-back comp because that's all they need at this point. It's not about being, like, completely dominating them in draft. It's about having the stronger draft. And whether this is, whether it's an 80-20 draft or a 60-40 draft, you can just kind of ride that out and not, as you can play out the rest of the draft without necessarily needing to take so many risks. And that's basically how this comp essentially works. And it gives a lot of time for G2 to play out the draft. In the rest of the games, we can quickly go over it as well while we're here. I think there wasn't too much setup that happened because as a result, but it's worth covering anyway because there's a new patch anyway. We can cover some highlights. So in this case, you can see the Nefiri X Factor. It was never let through the entire series. It doesn't seem like both teams were too comfortable on it since it's so weird, but you can see the differences in the new patch here. So there's going to be a Gwen B1. She got some really nice buffs. It changes her champion identity a lot. They pre-pick the Aurora counter pick, and you can see this is a classic forward versus backward sort of let's say draft battle. Let's put it this way. So it's a pretty even draft overall, and basically after the first the Gwen B1, the rest of the draft kind of just plays itself out because it's just a forward versus backward comp. It makes sense. Like, they're just gonna go Ezreal. They know that Movistar, when they pick Aurora Skarner, they have to go something like, a little bit more defensive on the mid lane. So they're gonna pre-pick the Yone, and then they it's basically pre-soft counter into the Azir. So, and then when Movistar have this comp identity, they just basically go for the Ezreal. They ban out the Varus and make sure there's no. They basically, in G2 just basically paved the way for their forward comp to actually have some level of effectiveness by removing all the backwards comps, all the backwards champs rather, and the draft just plays itself out, right? So there's nothing too crazy on this front. I think on this front as well, it's nothing insane, but I think it's because of G2's lack of agency that they took in this games in particular, that they kind of set themselves up to be actually losing against MKOI here. It's pretty well. I don't think it's like insanely well played by MKOI from a draft perspective, but it's more so that G2 kind of set themselves up to not really have much agency. So you can see the jungle bans here. They're pretty scared about a lot of the picks that they want to go for, and you can see why they're not too willing to pick the Mundo in this case, even though they're also red side, because this is only game 2. So there's still other champions that are still pretty relevant in this game. So it's only the Mundo itself would have been only relevant in a game 3 sort of scenario in their opinion. So, but the problem with this is that they give up Varus for free and they mismatch ban the Ezreal last game, or they let it go through last game. And now they're just focused on kind of playing catch up here because they give the Varus, they're basically going to have a losing matchup bottom. They don't get any food to play with because the Varus B1 gives nothing, so they can't rely on the strengths of red side. And then MKOI are just blinding all the good things that like allow them to not really show anything, right? This comp doesn't necessarily do anything special per se. It's just like a lot of the remaining picks that they got, and that gave them a free advantage. So this was G2's series to win or lose in this case, and I think overall they had some fumbles and it wasn't perfect, as no Fearless draft is. They did come up with some really creative ways to kind of come out on top, and I wanted to point that out here. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. I'll catch you in the next one.